They had no rifles, no body armor, no satellite intelligence, no air support, no supply chains delivering ammunition across thousands of miles. What they had was something that no military budget in history has ever successfully purchased: total mastery of the ground beneath their feet. In 1879, one of the most powerful military forces on Earth, armed with breech-loading rifles, artillery, and the full industrial might of a global empire, marched into a valley in southern Africa and was systematically destroyed by warriors carrying cowhide shields and short stabbing spears. The Battle of Isandlwana. 20,000 Zulu warriors against a British force considered invincible. The British lost. Not because the Zulus got lucky. Not because the terrain was unfamiliar. But because the Zulu military commanders executed a tactical formation so precise, so disciplined, and so psychologically devastating that it overwhelmed a modern army before a single artillery piece could be properly positioned. Here's what nobody tells you in the history books. The weapons were never the point. Across recorded history, from the rice paddies of Southeast Asia to the mountain passes of Afghanistan, from the dense forests of North America to the open plains of sub-Saharan Africa, tribal and indigenous communities have repeatedly, consistently, and sometimes catastrophically defeated modern military forces equipped with weapons generations ahead of anything their opponents carried. And every single time, the explanation was never supernatural. It was never luck. It was intelligence. Specifically, the kind of intelligence that no weapons manufacturer can build, no military academy can fully teach, and no amount of defense spending can replicate. Knowing your environment so completely that the enemy's technology becomes irrelevant inside it. The jungle doesn't care how sophisticated your rifle is if you cannot see the man firing the arrow. The mountain pass doesn't respect your armor if you are moving through it blind. And the warrior who has trained on this specific ground, in this specific weather, against this specific kind of opponent, since before he could walk, holds an advantage that no weapon system ever designed has successfully neutralized. By the end of this, you will understand exactly how they did it. And why it keeps happening. To understand how tribes consistently outsmarted modern weapons, you first need to understand what modern weapons were actually designed to do. And more importantly, what they were never designed to face. Every major leap in weapons technology across the last 3 centuries was designed with a specific opponent in mind. Muskets replaced swords because the opponent wore armor. Rifles replaced muskets because the opponent stood in formation. Artillery was refined because the opponent built fortifications. Tanks were developed because the opponent dug trenches. Drones were deployed because the opponent built anti-aircraft systems. Every weapon was an answer to a question. But tribal warfare never asked those questions. It asked completely different ones. How do you fight an enemy who controls the horizon? How do you neutralize superior firepower when retreat is not surrender but strategy? How do you turn the land itself into your most powerful weapon? These are not simple questions. They produced extraordinarily sophisticated answers. And those answers were refined not over years of military academy instruction, but over generations of lived experience on specific terrain, against specific threats, in specific conditions. Take the Apache people of the American Southwest, perhaps the most studied example of asymmetric tactical genius in military history. For nearly 3 decades, Apache warriors under leaders including Geronimo and Victorio evaded, outmaneuvered, and consistently frustrated the full military apparatus of the United States Army, an institution with virtually unlimited resources, telegraph communication, and modern repeating rifles. The Apache had none of those things. What they had was an intimate, almost cellular knowledge of approximately 25,000 square miles of desert and mountain terrain so brutal that it functioned as a natural weapons system in itself. They knew every water source, and more critically, they knew which ones the pursuing army would assume existed but didn't. They understood desert heat not as an obstacle but as an ally, timing movements to exploit the hours when pursuing forces were most physically degraded. They understood that the most powerful weapon in asymmetric warfare isn't the one that kills the most enemies. It's the one that makes the enemy destroy themselves. U.S. Army General George Crook, one of the most experienced officers ever deployed against the Apache, famously stated that fighting them was unlike anything in his military experience. Not because they were ferocious, but because they were invisible. Present only when they chose to be. Gone before any response could be mounted. That invisibility wasn't magic. It was mastery. And it was a mastery built on a principle that every tribal community that successfully resisted modern weapons understood instinctively. You do not fight the weapon. You fight the assumptions of the person holding it. But the Apache story is only the beginning. Because once you understand the principle behind how tribes outsmarted modern weapons, you start seeing it everywhere. Across every continent. Across every era. Against every military power that ever assumed technological superiority was the same thing as battlefield dominance. It is not. It never was. In 1879, the same year the British Empire was processing its catastrophic defeat at Isandlwana, a Zulu force was simultaneously demonstrating something that military strategists still study today, the complete neutralization of firepower advantage through superior tactical geometry. The impondo zankomo, the horns of the buffalo formation, was not invented in response to British rifles. It had existed for generations, developed under the military architect Shaka Zulu decades earlier. But it was applied against modern weapons with a precision that revealed something profound. A formation designed to encircle and overwhelm does not become less effective because the enclosed enemy carries rifles. It becomes more effective. Because rifles require distance to function. The horns of the buffalo were specifically designed to eliminate distance, to close the gap between opposing forces so rapidly and from so many directions simultaneously that the technological advantage of ranged weapons became geometrically impossible to apply. The British soldiers at Isandlwana were not outgunned. They were outfought. And here is where the conflict deepens into something genuinely unsettling for anyone who believes weapons technology is the primary determinant of military outcomes. The Vietnamese conflict of the 20th century produced perhaps the most thoroughly documented case of tribal and guerrilla tactics neutralizing an overwhelmingly superior technological military force in recorded history. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces faced an opponent with air superiority, napalm, artillery, helicopter gunships, advanced communications, and virtually unlimited industrial supply. They responded with tunnels. The Siu Kai tunnel network, stretching over 250 kilometers beneath the jungle floor of South Vietnam, was not a primitive fallback position. It was a sophisticated underground civilization. Hospitals, ammunition storage, command centers, living quarters. Entire military operations planned and executed from beneath the feet of an enemy that controlled the sky, the sea, and the surface. The opponent controlled 3 dimensions. The tribes built a 4th. And in that 4th dimension, dug by hand, navigated without instruments, maintained through collective knowledge passed between communities, the technological advantage of the most powerful military in the world counted for almost nothing. Bombing campaigns that should have obliterated defensive positions instead struck empty jungle. Search operations that should have uncovered enemy infrastructure instead walked across concealed entrances without detection. The entire apparatus of modern military intelligence, satellites, aerial reconnaissance, electronic surveillance, was systematically defeated by people with shovels and an intimate, generational understanding of their own Earth. The weapons didn't fail. The assumptions behind them did. But here is where the story moves beyond military history and into something that should genuinely reframe the way you understand human intelligence itself. Because the Zulu formation and the Siu Kai tunnels are extraordinary. But they are not anomalies. They are expressions of a principle so consistent across tribal military history that its repetition cannot be explained by coincidence. That principle has a name in modern military theory. It is called asymmetric warfare. But tribal communities did not read the theory. They wrote it, in blood, on real ground, against real opponents, centuries before any military academy gave it a name. Consider the mountain warriors of what is now Afghanistan. For over 2 centuries, against the British Empire in the 19th century, against Soviet armored divisions in the 1980s, against NATO coalition forces in the 21st century, the fighters of that specific mountain terrain have produced the same outcome against 3 of the most powerful military organizations in human history. Not because the weapons improved each time. In many engagements, they did not. But because the terrain did not change. And the relationship between the fighters and that terrain, the generational, embodied, cellular knowledge of every valley, every ridgeline, every seasonal weather pattern, every natural acoustic property of those specific mountains, did not change either. The British called them fierce. The Soviets called them fanatical. NATO analysts called them adaptive. They were none of those things specifically. They were local. And local knowledge, applied with discipline and patience against an opponent operating far from home in unfamiliar conditions, is a force multiplier that no weapon system has ever successfully countered. Here is a specific example that illustrates this with painful clarity. During the Soviet-Afghan War, Soviet military planners deployed the most sophisticated helicopter gunship technology available, the Mil-24, known as the Hind, against Mujahideen fighters in mountain terrain. The helicopter was virtually invulnerable to the small arms available to the fighters at the time. It dominated the battlefield completely, until the fighters learned something critical about the specific mountain air. At altitude, in the thin air of the Afghan highlands, the Hind's performance was significantly degraded. Its ceiling was lower. Its maneuverability was reduced. Its thermal signature against certain sky and terrain backgrounds was more visible. And the specific mountain valleys funneled the helicopter's approach into predictable corridors that a fighter with patience and positional knowledge could anticipate and prepare for. When Stinger missiles eventually arrived, they were devastatingly effective. But the knowledge of where to stand, when to fire, and which approach corridor the helicopter would use, that knowledge came from months of patient observation by people who understood their mountains the way a musician understands their instrument. The weapon was American technology. The targeting intelligence was ancient and entirely local. Then there is the story of the Seminole people of Florida, who fought the United States government to what historians now acknowledge was effectively a draw across 3 separate wars spanning decades. In terrain, the Florida Everglades, that the U.S. Army found nearly impossible to operate in, the Seminole moved, lived, and fought with complete fluency. Supply lines that the Army required, they did not. Reinforcements the Army needed, they replaced with intimate community networks. Intelligence that the Army sought through expensive reconnaissance, they gathered by simply living in the territory they were defending. The Everglades was not a hiding place. It was a weapons system. And the Seminole were its operators. This is the pattern. This is what every engagement in this entire history shares. The tribe does not try to match the weapon. It makes the weapon irrelevant by choosing, shaping, and mastering the conditions in which the weapon must be used. Here is the twist. And unlike the battles in this story, it arrives quietly. The most powerful military forces in human history were not defeated by better weapons. They were defeated by a form of intelligence so fundamental, so deeply human, that modern civilization has spent 3 centuries systematically dismantling it without ever fully understanding what it was. Call it local knowledge. Call it environmental mastery. Call it asymmetric intelligence. Whatever name you give it, the historical record delivers the same verdict every single time. The person who knows the ground wins. Not always immediately. Not always completely. But with a consistency so profound across so many centuries, so many cultures, so many technological gaps, that dismissing it as coincidence requires a deliberate refusal to look at the evidence. And here is what makes this genuinely important beyond military history. Every single tribe, every single community, every single group of fighters that successfully outsmarted modern weapons shared one foundational characteristic that had nothing to do with courage, nothing to do with desperation, and nothing to do with any mystical connection to the land. They paid attention. Generationally. Collectively. Consistently. They paid attention to their specific environment in a depth and duration that produced knowledge no instrument could replicate and no outside force could purchase. They knew which wind preceded rain. They knew which animal behavior signaled approaching danger. They knew which routes their enemy would logically choose, and precisely why those routes were wrong. They knew these things because survival had always depended on knowing them. And survival had been the curriculum for longer than any military academy has existed. Now here is the part that should unsettle anyone living in the modern world. We are losing this. Not through conquest. Not through force. Through comfort and disconnection. The average person in an industrialized society has less direct, embodied knowledge of their immediate physical environment than at any point in human history. We navigate with devices that tell us where we are because we have lost the ability to know it ourselves. We read weather forecasts because we have lost the ability to read the sky. We consume maps because we have lost the intimate, cellular relationship with specific terrain that once made certain communities functionally unconquerable. The tribes that outsmarted modern weapons were not exceptional people. They were paying attention people. And the most dangerous opponent any military force has ever faced was not the one with the most sophisticated weapons, the most elaborate tactics, or the most fanatical commitment to a cause. It was the quiet person, on familiar ground, who had been watching since before the enemy arrived, and would still be watching long after the last weapon was spent. There is a lesson in every engagement covered in this video. And it is the same lesson. Technology solves the problems it was designed for. Wisdom solves the problems technology never imagined. The Zulu commander who drew the horns of the buffalo in the dust was not working against British rifles. He was working with something the rifles could not touch. The Vietnamese engineer who carved a fourth dimension beneath the jungle floor was not hiding from American air power. She was building in a space air power had never thought to look. The Apache scout who read a desert water source and moved an entire community 3 days ahead of pursuit was not running from the United States Army. He was operating in a reality the Army's maps had no language for. These were not military victories. They were acts of deep attention, the most ancient and most powerful form of human intelligence, applied with discipline, patience, and an unbroken relationship with the ground beneath their feet. And the question worth carrying with you, the one this history insists on asking. In a world where we outsource our attention to devices, our navigation to satellites, and our environmental awareness to apps, what kind of intelligence are we quietly surrendering? And what will it cost us when we need it most? Leave your answer in the comments. Share this with someone who thinks the most powerful weapon ever built is made of metal. And if you want to keep discovering the intelligence that history forgot to celebrate, subscribe. Because the most important lessons were never in the textbooks.